Hi everyone. You've reached lecture 2 on intersectionality. This is a online lecture that will have to be completed by June 12th. Keep in mind that as you're watching this lecture, there will be questions that you will have to answer in order to receive credit. So here we go. Race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. The 4 markers of social identity we are examining in this class. Not too long ago, they were each understood as completely separate issues when studying diversity in the United States. This view, which was called essentialism, held that there were core components of one's racial identity which, for example, had no observable relationship to one's class or sexual identity or gender or socioeconomic standing, and vice versa. The essentialist viewpoint used overgeneralizations and even stereotypes to attribute all members of a social group the characteristics of a dominant subset of that group, while ignoring the complexities and contradictions that came with the consideration and interaction of all markers of social identity. So in other words, we don't see ourselves only as a woman or man, or merely white or black, or merely gay or straight. We know that our identities are far more complex, as are the systems of oppression which marginalize us. Today, scholars agree that race, class, gender, and sexual orientation, along with ethnicity, nationality, and religion, age, and educational background, are all integral in the construction of one's identity in the world, although not always in equal proportion. These intersections were once referred to as the race-gender-class matrix, but for our sake we will refer to it as the intersectional approach. Now, originally, intersectionality referred to the ways in which systems of discrimination and oppression interacted and overlapped across all axes of the race and class and gender matrix, but more recently, as we find, the term has been used by scholars and activists as a rallying cry for greater inclusion and sophistication in the understanding of diversity. And this is why it's really important as the media scholars we are, to think about the ways in which this approach might help us view media texts. So what exactly is intersectionality, and where does the term come from? Well, intersectionality comes from feminism, which at its most basic definition is the belief that women should share the same social, political, and economic rights as men. However, when theorist Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in 1989, she was writing at a time when many black women, and especially many black lesbians, felt neglected from within the feminist and anti-racist movements because their specific concerns and experiences of oppression and discrimination did not always fit comfortably within any group. It's important to remember that the earliest American feminist movements of the late 19th century, and this was sometimes known as first wave feminism, rallied behind the cry for giving women the right to vote, which of course was great and commendable. But in doing so, this supposedly universal suffrage movement was predominantly championed by and directed toward white women with some degree of economic privilege. So the belief in the united and universal sisterhood fighting against the patriarchy, however well-intentioned it might have been, was actually a belief that all too often excluded the voices and experiences of economically underprivileged or LGBT or non-white women, and for this reason it is known as white feminism or mainstream feminism, this sort of excluding brand of feminism. Intersectional feminism, on the other hand, holds that women experience oppression in varying configurations and in varying degrees of intensity. So cultural patterns of oppression are not only related, but bound together and influenced by the intersectional systems of society. So what does that mean? In other words, intersectionality considers the varied ways in which a single person can identify him or herself through race, class, gender, or sexual orientation, and how each marker of identity contributes to different forms of oppression and subjugation by dominant social groups, which, for our sake, we can call the white patriarchy. So Crenshaw writes that although intersectionality was originally articulated on behalf of black women, the term actually brought to light the invisibility of many constituents within groups that claimed themselves as members, but maybe failed to represent them fully. For example, people of color within the LGBTQ movements, or people with disabilities fighting police abuse, or immigrants who are victims of sexual abuse. When we use these terms like intersectionality and intersectional feminism, it's important to remember that we're not really talking about only women's issues, but a sophisticated combination of many different identities and identifications, which really makes the notion of a single essentialist minority group a vast oversimplification. And this is something that we're going to have to remember when we're talking about constructing identity. So now that we have a basic working definition of intersectionality, let's look at how we can use it to critically examine and interrogate images within US media. So one crucial difference between mainstream feminism and intersectional feminism is that while the former challenges the patriarchal institutional forces which cause injustice and inequality, the latter does the same, but actually goes a step further by emphasizing that these forces of inequality and their effects are not felt the same by all women or men in many cases. So, just as we have to be savvy media consumers and active questioning audiences of the media, we also have to be careful when we use the term feminist representation, because we might be talking about mainstream feminism or intersectional feminism depending on what we're looking at. So as an example, we can look at a show like Sex and the City and make a reasonable case that the show does illustrate some major tenets of mainstream feminism. Its depiction of four single, working, sexually liberated women in New York City who resist and occasionally mock the patriarchy, and they're shown to have agency and free will. But if we look a little bit deeper, we can also see that Sex and the City falls short of exemplifying intersectional feminism for a few major reasons. For one thing, the female protagonists are all white, they're all economically privileged, and while the show includes some depictions of LGBT characters, they are often stereotyped and marginalized. And most importantly, the ways in which Carrie Bradshaw and her friends are shown to be oppressed, if we could even really use that word, it's not really all that inclusive of diverse voices and identities. The reality is it only depicts a specific subset of a white, heteronormative economic elite. And so for those reasons, we might say, if we're taking an intersectional approach, the show is problematic in some respects. Now, of course, fans of Sex and the City may argue that the show was never truly feminist in the first place, let alone realistic. So let's look at a recent high-profile story involving the entertainment industry. Recently, House of Cards star Robin Wright, and you may have heard about this story, Robin Wright made headlines when she demanded that she earn the same amount of money as her male co-star, Kevin Spacey. Now, no one would deny that Wright's actions were courageous and helped in drawing attention to the considerable and important issue of gender wage inequality. And as you hopefully are aware of, women in the United States earn on average only 78 cents per every dollar that a man earns. So there are significant issues. But what lies beneath the surface of this story is a far more complex picture when viewed through an intersectional lens. Robin Wright is an economically privileged heterosexual white woman who has the ability to summon media attention when she has personally experienced prejudice, which is something that not everyone has the luxury of having. And in fact, if you look a little deeper at the story, you can also see that she earns $420,000 per episode, which is $80,000 less than Kevin Spacey, but it's still a considerable amount of money. So to call Wright oppressed ignores many of her clear cultural advantages in terms of her class and race. And this is by no means a criticism of Robin Wright, or even a criticism of the news media outlets which covered the story, but only a reminder that intersectionality asks us to consider all four markers of social identity when it comes to labeling someone oppressed. So, while an intersectional approach would applaud Robin Wright for bringing to light an important issue of gender inequality, it might also go a step further in reminding us that, for example, it's only white women that earn 78 cents to the dollar, while Native American women on average earn 65 cents, Black women make 64 cents, and Hispanic women on average make only 54 cents per every dollar that a man makes in the labor force. So you can see that the intersectional approach goes a little bit deeper in looking at issues involving all four aspects of social identity. So the protagonist of Pariah, which you can see on the left, it's the film assigned for Friday's class. She's a black teenager named Alike, and she has to hide her homosexuality from her friends and family for fear of prejudice and disownment. So not only does the film Pariah do a pretty good job of avoiding stereotypes, due in large part to the fact that it is an independent film with a predominantly non-white cast and crew, but it also illustrates the complexities of intersectionality. So Alike may be significantly oppressed and even repressed as a lesbian, but perhaps less so as an African American due to the fact that she lives in a middle class, not upper class, but middle class, relatively harmonious neighborhood in Brooklyn. Alike's identity as a queer black teenager may perhaps not be representative of a large population, but it does fulfill one of the central goals of intersectionality, which is to show the experiences of a person facing multiple oppressions, and a person whose visibility and representations have been virtually non-existent within mainstream U.S. media. So I also want you to think about, you can see for yourself how the intersectional approach sort of manifests itself and is evident in the first episode of Orange is the New Black, which is also assigned for Friday. So in sort of summing everything up, the reason we are looking at intersectionality before launching into our more in-depth studies of race, gender, sexual orientation, and class is because this course is designed with an intersectional framework to diversity. What does that mean? This means that we cannot divorce race from gender or separate sexual orientation from class or remove ethnicity from economic privilege. Each are connected and integral. These identities and their complex interactions are going to be evident in all of the films and TV shows that we screen. Now, it may come as a surprise that a one-size-all approach to feminism or studies of race or sexuality actually perpetuates misunderstandings and oversimplifications. But it should not come as a surprise, however, that the way a black woman experiences sexism and inequality has fundamental differences from the way that a white woman experiences sexism and inequality, which is to say that that is also different from the way that a trans woman experiences sexism and inequality, which is different from an Asian American man, etc. Okay, so intersectionality isn't meant to provide comfort or closure, and this is a very important element of it, but is instead designed to challenge your own assumptions about how the media essentializes identities and prejudice while overlooking the importance of differences in one's race, gender, sexuality, and class. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I'll see you next week.